Okay, let's dive right into this explainer and see how a localized geopolitical conflict can send economic shockwaves straight to your wallet. When we hear about conflicts halfway across the globe, it's so incredibly easy to view them as distant events, things that just happen on the news, but not in our actual neighborhoods. But let's be real. The reality of our modern hyper-connected world is that geopolitical shocks absolutely do not respect borders. We're going to look closely at exactly how a conflict between the United States and Iran would completely rewrite the financial realities of citizens all over the globe.
It really all boils down to one massive question, doesn't it? What happens to your grocery bill, your savings, and your investments if a US-Iran war drags on for months? Because global energy markets, shipping routes, and financial systems are so deeply interwoven, a Middle East conflict affects economies way, way beyond the actual battlefields. We're not just talking about military maneuvers here. We're talking about a massive disruption to the very bloodline of the global economy. Literally everything from the cost to power your home to the price of a loaf of bread, to the interest rate on your mortgage is directly tied into this web.
To make sense of all of this, we're going to trace this economic ripple effect geographically. Our agenda today covers the global oil epicenter, the U.S. economic impact, the Commonwealth ripple, the developing economy shock, and finally, 3 conflict scenarios. We'll start right at the epicenter and move outward to see exactly how different regions are impacted.
Part 1. The Global Oil Epicenter. Any disruption to the Strait of Hormuz immediately chokes off global oil transportation and drives up energy prices worldwide. This strait isn't just a stretch of water. It is arguably the single most important maritime choke point in the entire world for energy. When tensions rise in this region, the threat isn't just to local infrastructure. It's the very real threat that the massive ships carrying the oil that literally powers our global economy will be delayed, rerouted, or just stopped entirely. And the moment the market even senses a disruption in oil transit, global energy prices absolutely skyrocket.
And it's wild how a single drop of oil splinters into literally every aspect of our daily lives. Oil goes up, boom, transportation costs jump. That bleeds right into the grocery basket, meaning increased food prices because, well, it costs more to run the tractors and shift the produce. It triggers sudden spikes in manufacturing costs because factories are suddenly paying way more for power and raw materials. And all of this rolls up into one massive headache for everyday people: rising global inflation. The basic price tag on life itself simply gets more expensive.
Section 2. The U.S. economic impact.
American consumers would feel the pain right off the bat at the gas pump, which feeds directly into persistent, stubborn inflation. But it goes a lot deeper than that. A surge in military spending puts massive weight on the federal budget, rapidly driving up the national deficit. We'd also undoubtedly see stock market volatility as investors completely panic over the uncertainty. To fight off all this resulting inflation, central banks are forced to hike interest rates, which acts like a giant anchor dragging down the housing market and auto loans. Ultimately, all of this creates a severe slowdown in consumer spending and broader economic growth.
But here is the crucial caveat. Because the U.S. possesses a massive, highly diversified economy, it absolutely faces serious risks, but it is not automatically looking at an economic collapse. It's really vital to distinguish between a severe economic strain and a total disaster. The U.S. produces its own energy, has incredibly robust tech and service sectors, and holds deep financial reserves. So while the American consumer will undoubtedly feel a brutal squeeze at the grocery store and the gas station, the immense scale of the U.S. economy acts as a powerful shock absorber against complete financial ruin.
Section 3. The Commonwealth ripple.
This is where the ripple effect gets really fascinating because it looks incredibly different depending on where you actually live. We can generally split these Commonwealth nations into 2 distinct camps: the energy exporters, like Canada and Australia on one side, and the energy importers, like the UK and New Zealand on the other. Let's look at the exporters first. Canada is a huge energy producer, and Australia is a major commodity exporter. In the events of an oil shock, some of their domestic energy companies and government revenues might actually see massive financial gains due to skyrocketing global prices. But here's the ultimate paradox, right? The national balance sheet might get a treasure chest bump from those soaring commodity prices, but the everyday citizen is still going to be furious at the pump. While the government rakes it in, the consumer's wallet is still taking a hit from general inflation. And perhaps most dangerously, if the entire global economy slows down due to the war, it eventually crushes the overall demand for Canadian and Australian exports anyway.
On the flip side, energy importing economies like the UK and New Zealand are exceptionally vulnerable and take a brutal direct hit. The UK would see severe pressure on household budgets as energy and food costs soar, which would almost certainly lead to interest rate hikes to try and fight off that inflation. Meanwhile, New Zealand is geographically isolated and highly exposed to imported fuel costs. It would cost an absolute fortune just to get goods to the island, leading to drastically reduced household purchasing power. For both of these importing nations, they share a very real risk of slower economic growth because they just have to absorb the full, heavy price of the energy shock without any domestic oil revenues to cushion the blow.
Section 4. Developing Economy Shock.
When we look at developing nations, countries like Pakistan are incredibly exposed. Why? Because they rely heavily on foreign petroleum imports just to keep their countries running. Unlike the US or Canada, developing nations often simply do not have the vast foreign exchange reserves or the domestic energy production required to cushion a massive international oil shock. It triggers this devastating step-by-step chain reaction. Step 1. A war abroad disrupts oil supplies and prices shoot up. Step 2. Because oil is instantly more expensive, Pakistan's national import bill skyrockets. Step 3. To pay that massive import bill, they have to drain their foreign reserves, which mounts tremendous pressure on the Pakistani rupee, rapidly devaluing the currency. Step 4. A weaker currency combined with expensive oil means domestic petrol and transportation costs spike sharply. And finally, Step 5, food prices and overall inflation surge to absolute crisis levels. It is a tragic domino effect where a conflict thousands of miles away can quickly make basic food transport completely unaffordable for everyday citizens.
And finally, Section 5. 3 conflict scenarios.
So if the conflict is short-lived, we're looking at Scenario 1. This involves a sharp but temporary panic in the markets. Oil prices would spike quickly, and stock markets would experience some brief, intense volatility as investors react to the scary headlines. But as it becomes clear the conflict isn't going to drag on forever, global economies would correct, adapt, and move toward a gradual economic stabilization. It's a shock, for sure, but a manageable one that doesn't fundamentally break the system over the long term.
Scenario 2 is a whole lot more concerning. If the war drags on for several months, those initial price shocks literally bake right into the system. High energy prices just become the new normal, and that leads to stubborn, persistent inflation across the board. To combat this inflation that just won't quit, central banks are forced to maintain elevated interest rates for a long time, which makes borrowing incredibly expensive. And you know what happens when businesses and consumers can't afford to borrow? You get a prolonged period of slower economic growth worldwide.
Then there's Scenario 3, the absolute worst case, a major disruption to the Strait of Hormuz. This triggers a massive, immediate supply shock that completely upends global shipping and energy availability. This isn't just about prices going up anymore. It's about the physical supply of oil being completely inaccessible. This creates a severe international economic shock that would completely outpace both of the previous scenarios, plunging global markets into deep uncertainty and threatening the basic underlying frameworks of international trade.
So, what's the bottom line here? Ultimately, the severity of the economic damage across all the nations we've just discussed really hinges on 3 huge dominoes. First, duration. How long the conflict lasts is literally everything. Second, infrastructure damage, whether vital energy infrastructure is actually destroyed or just merely threatened. And third, shipping routes, whether global passages, especially the Strait of Hormuz, remain open for business. These 3 factors alone will determine if the world faces a brief economic hiccup or a grinding multi-year financial crisis.
As we've seen in this explainer, the true cost of modern conflict is often paid right at your local grocery store and the gas pump. The actual combat might be localized, but the economic chain reaction, the higher oil prices, the inflation, the expensive borrowing, and weaker consumer spending, that reaches every single corner of the globe, from the United States to the UK to Pakistan. Which leaves us with a final, very personal question to consider. Just how resilient is your wallet to a war half a world away? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep learning.